Good morning, everyone. My name is Bhavna. My partners' names are Amna and Shale, and today we will be discussing our evolution as one of the only primates fit for long-distance endurance running in the world. The Berlin Marathon is an annual running competition held in the capital of Germany that calls for hundreds of thousands of top marathon runners around the world. The marathon consists of a 42-kilometer course through the streets of the bustling city. The world record, it's held by Ethiopian track runner Haile Gebrselassie. In 2008, he finished the entire race in 2 hours, 3 minutes, and 59 seconds. This means he ran at a consistent pace of 5 meters a second for a little over 2 hours. Now, you and I obviously can't match this world record pace. Let us say that an average North State student can run at around 2 to 3 meters per second for around 15 minutes if we really push ourselves. But how does this value compare to other members of the animal kingdom? Are we unique in our endurance running capabilities? Well, yes and no. Looking at raw speed alone, a horse can run at 15 to 20 meters a second for the same duration of time it takes us to maintain 3 meters per second. This is an insane amount of speed. Other quadruped mammal speeds hover around that same value, such as greyhounds, antelopes, and wildebeest. But if we really want to compare our skills, let's take a look at our closest animal relatives, the primates, to see how they hold up. In some ways, our endurance running capabilities really are superior and one of a kind, adapted after thousands of years of constant evolution. The first characteristic we excel at is speed, when body mass and our anatomical differences are accounted for. If we relate ourselves to other primates, we can run for much faster and longer than the average ape, who mainly depends on short bursts of sprinting. Our endurance running abilities make us comparable to other animals known for their speeds. We can also run for much longer distances than the average primate despite our primate ancestry. However, our running skills fall apart when we get to our energy efficiency. The graph you see here is a representation of the metabolic cost of transport between humans and horses. It compares the amount of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body mass after a distance of 1 kilometer is run versus the speed in meters per second. Humans switch to running at a speed of around 2.3 to 2.5 meters per second, as this becomes less costly once we can exploit a mass spring mechanism. Basically, we store energy in our highly elastic ligaments and tendons, which is released in a burst of energy once we propel ourselves forward. Similarly, horses change from walking to trotting to galloping once it becomes more energy efficient for them. Both the human and horse metabolic cost of transport is a U-shaped curve, where the lowest point in the graph represents the maximum speed achievable with the least amount of energy input required. However, on average, even if a human and a horse are moving at the exact same speed, humans use almost 50% more oxygen than horses do. Even other primates are able to sprint more efficiently than we can, giving us a serious disadvantage when it comes to long-term endurance running. Still, you may notice that when a human begins to run, the metabolic curve turns pretty much flat, while the curve of a galloping horse is still curved. When running, humans can increase their speed continuously without suffering a great metabolic penalty, while horses have to expend more and more energy even while running. But the question we want to ask ourselves is, how does this relate to evolution? How did we evolve to reach this exact physiological state, where we excel at endurance running in comparison to our primate ancestors? Here we run into some issues using the fossil record to back up these features. We lack a lot of crucial evidence that could be helpful in our investigation. For example, ligaments and tendons are rarely preserved in older fossils. These characteristics are rarely well sampled either. However, we can still examine the physical evidence present for 4 different features that we analyze in endurance running: energetics, strength, stabilization, and thermoregulation. If we look at these characteristics carefully, we can even present some possible evolutionary hypotheses for the adaptation of endurance running.
Humans exhibit many musculoskeletal specializations for bipedalism. Given the fundamental biomechanical contrasts between walking and running, what features are specifically relevant to energy cost of running? As previously noted, the mass spring mechanics of running differ from the pendular mechanics of walking. Running uses a compliant limb in which muscles and tendons in the leg sequentially store and release strain energy during the stance phase of the stride cycle. Compared to apes, human legs have much longer spring-like tendons connected to short muscle fascicles that can generate force economically. These springs can have comparatively little effect on energy saving during pendulum-like walking. Compared to running, it saves approximately 50% of the metabolic cost. Another factor to consider when evaluating the evolution of endurance running in humans is skeletal strength. Running exposes the skeletal system to much higher stresses than walking, especially when the foot collides with the ground. This produces a shock wave that passes up through the body from the heel, through the spine, and to the head. Peak vertical ground reaction forces at heel strike are approximately twice as high during running than walking, and can possibly approach 3 to 4 times the body weight at higher endurance running speeds. Human runners can reduce these stresses to some extent through limb compliance and mid-foot striking. This stores elastic strain energy in the leg and foot, but must otherwise dissipate impact forces within their bones and joints. The main way to lower joint stress is to expand joint surfaces, and therefore you spread the force over a much larger area.
All right, cool. So now we can talk a little bit more about the special mechanisms involved in stabilization and balance. So I'm sure we've all seen how our head and neck is slightly angled forward when we run, causing us to pitch forward a little bit, bringing up the point for head stabilization here, which I will discuss in just a sec. Along with this, it makes sense that muscles such as the gluteus maximus and the erector spinae muscles would also be a little bit more prominent and enlarged, since they are indeed pretty important for running. But because of that, you would have to expect greater surface area around the sacrum and posterior iliac spine, or any other or any other bones where these muscles would have to insert or attach. The sacroiliac joint is a pretty good example of this, since the transverse process of the sacrum is a little bit larger to account for the greater definition and prominence of the muscles. So there are also some interesting features to note for counterbalancing torsional forces from the ground while running. We see this with the isolated rotation of the trunk relative to the hips to create a distinction between the thorax and the pelvis. And this creates an overall greater structural independence of the pelvic girdle and the head. So we kind of see this a lot better in the image shown over here, where we see a more extensive muscular connection network being formed between the shoulder and head neck complex of an ape versus the shoulder and head neck complex of a human, where the muscles instead act as a more independent unit. And so that's why we have like a little bit more adaptability to the forces of torque and torsional forces and strengths. So if we also look at this image over here, we can see that I already kind of mentioned how humans have a greater tendency to pitch their head forward when running. And this can be accounted due to the nuchal ligament, which is pretty important for serving the weight of the head and thus being important for running uniquely in humans. And this ligament is also not present in chimps. Right. So moving along to heat as a physiological challenge to look into, there are quite a few non-musculoskeletal traits that have evolved to combat this. So eccrine sweat glands are pretty important for evapotranspiration. I'm sure we all know how sweating cools down the body in this sense and how that works. Reduced body hair has also been shown to help increase convection rate. And then countercurrent exchange occurring in the venous circulation of the cranium is another interesting feature. And then lastly, human distance runners are more attuned to mouth breathing due to better ventilation of air and less resistance. So this also further helps to unload excess heat that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. All right, so of course, this brings up our initial question about why long distance running seemed to have played such an important role in human evolution. So some hypotheses suggest that endurance running became a component in human evolution as a byproduct of enhanced walking capabilities. And sure, this does kind of make some sense, since many of the characteristics in this table are actually due to long distance walking performance in the heat, such as longer legs, narrower waists, and shorter toes. And I kind of circle that in a darker purple, if you can see. But aside from just these, we also discussed many other mechanisms that make our body suitable for endurance running. And we can certainly see other adaptations for stabilization of the joints, for storage and release of elastic energy, which certainly play a role in running. And so I circled some additional features on this table because everything is super fine and tiny. But all the stuff in red is kind of stuff that I talked about or the article talked about in terms of distinctions between running and walking in order to further expand on our evolutionary hypothesis, right? So at the end of the day, we can still conclude that the genus Homo has evolved to travel long distances through both walking and running. Fossil records are still being looked into to see whether these actions are or were concurrently occurring at the time in evolution, or if one preceded the other. Even more difficult is understanding why selection for endurance running seemed to be emphasized in the first place. And a hypothesis for this could just be that early hominids were able to utilize these skills in order to exploit protein rich resources while hunting and scavenging. But again, the factor of technology, such as bows and arrows, kind of negates that theory. And then perhaps endurance running also could have evolved for predator pursuit to outrun the prey. But again, this would also be energetically expensive with a minimum yield or benefit to the human. Of course, endurance running could have also just been seen as like some sort of vantage point. So, in order to allow early hominids to gain some upper hand or leverage when scavenging and competing for protein resources. So, to sum this all up, in general, additional research is certainly required to examine more thoroughly the implications of endurance running throughout human evolution. For now, we'll just have to stick to training for marathons and running for fun in the meantime, while figuring out the roots to this recreational activity. At the side over here, I included a little chart that summed up a lot of the things that I talked about, such as eccrine sweating and longer legs, lighter feet, larger backs, and muscles such as the gluteus maximus, and a few other characteristics. If you guys have any questions, now would be a great time. And thank you so much for listening.